Marble Falls in autumn always carried that faint, earthy scent of dry leaves and damp soil. A smell that wrapped itself around the quiet streets like an old memory. It reminded me of the early days of my marriage to Jonas, when we were still young enough to believe that love in a small town could be shielded from temptation, that the dirt roads and slow sunsets would keep us safe from whatever broke other couples apart. But as I stood in our small cedar kitchen that night, staring at Jonas's smartwatch lying on the counter like a harmless piece of metal, I knew that belief had been wearing thin for a while, like the chipped paint on our porch railing, slowly eaten away by sun and wind. It had started with small things no one else would notice: Jonas coming home later than usual, his gaze wandering when I asked about work at the repair shop, his habit of helping a customer after dark. I told myself it was just the nature of his business, that as a nurse I understood long, unpredictable hours. But deep down, something kept tapping at me, quiet, persistent, like the sound of wind rattling a loose window latch while the whole town slept. And then, that night, just after 3 a.m., the quiet broke. A soft beep came from the smartwatch. In the dark, its small square face lit up, throwing a pale glow across the countertop. I turned my head, expecting just a text notification. But the screen showed a voice memo icon, and right above it, the contact name, Sable, Bar. My blood went cold before the audio even started playing. Then a woman's low, throaty voice filled the kitchen, clear enough to make me feel like I was standing in the same room with her. "Jonas, I can't believe you did that in the bar," she laughed softly. And then his voice, Jonas's voice, quick, low, urgent. "Shish, don't say that so loud. Clara will get suspicious." My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I could hear it in my ears. I sat down without realizing it, gripping the edge of the table, staring at the watch as if it were a living witness to something I wasn't supposed to hear. The recording went on, muffled sounds of a chair scraping the floor, glasses clinking, and then the voices fading until the memo ended. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen. By the time I looked up, the first pale light of dawn was seeping in through the window. Jonas was asleep on the couch in the living room, looking like he hadn't moved all night. But the watch had told me a different story. A story I couldn't unhear, a truth I couldn't unknow. From that moment, I decided not to confront him, yet. I wanted to see how far Jonas would go before the web he was spinning wrapped so tightly around him there'd be no way out. The thing about a small town like Marble Falls is that secrets are like seeds dropped into shallow soil. They sprout fast, sometimes overnight. And no matter how carefully you try to hide them, they find their way into the light. I knew that better than most, having grown up here. But I also knew the danger of moving too quickly. Confronting Jonas that morning would have been the easy thing to do. But easy wasn't the same as smart. So I poured him coffee like I always did, kissed him lightly on the cheek, and listened to him talk about the carburetor he had to fix for Mr. Owens's tractor, his voice steady, his eyes calm, like nothing had happened. If I hadn't heard that recording, I might have believed him. But the smartwatch was still sitting on the counter, and I'd already synced it to my phone before he came into the kitchen. The file safe in a hidden folder he'd never think to look for. That day at the clinic, between patient check-ins and blood pressure readings, I thought about Sable Hart. Everyone in town knew her. She worked nights at the Copper Mule, the only bar worth going to unless you like drinking out of a cooler at the gas station. She was the kind of woman who drew eyes the moment she walked in, not just because she was beautiful, but because she carried herself like she knew exactly how much power that beauty gave her. I'd never spoken more than a few polite words to her when Jonas and I stopped in for a beer months ago. Now, her name lived in my phone alongside a recording that could tear my life apart. That night, I didn't wait for Jonas to fall asleep. Instead, I pretended to be exhausted from work, went to bed early, and lay in the dark listening. Around midnight, he stepped out of the bedroom, his phone lighting the hallway as he padded toward the back door. I waited a few minutes before slipping out of bed, my bare feet silent on the wood floor. Through the window, I saw him sitting in his truck, the cab glowing blue from the screen of his phone. His mouth moved, his hand gestured. I couldn't hear a word, but I didn't need to. He came back in 20 minutes later smelling faintly of whiskey and something else I couldn't name, something that made my stomach knot. Over the next week, I built a routine. Every night, I checked the smartwatch. Sometimes there was nothing. Sometimes there were little scraps, Sable's laugh, the sound of country music in the background, Jonas saying he'd be there soon. He never noticed the watch missing for the few minutes it took me to sync the data. And during the day, I played the part of the oblivious wife while watching him more closely than I ever had. It didn't take long for the town to start whispering. A patient at the clinic asked me casually if Jonas was working late more often. The clerk at the grocery store mentioned seeing him at the Copper Mule on a Tuesday night. I smiled and shrugged, as if none of it mattered. As if my heart wasn't a tight fist in my chest. By the time the first real piece of proof came, I was ready. It was a Thursday, and Jonas claimed he had to stay late to finish repairing an engine for a farmer 2 towns over. But just after midnight, the smartwatch beeped again. This time the recording was longer, nearly 3 minutes. I stood in the kitchen, holding my phone to my ear as I listened to Sable say, "You worry too much. She's not going to find out." And Jonas's reply, "You don't know Clara. She notices everything." My name in his mouth made me feel both powerful and powerless all at once, like a storm brewing over still water. There was a pause, then the sound of a kiss, wet and deliberate, and Sable's voice again. Softer now. "Then maybe we just need to make it so she can't notice." The recording ended there, leaving me with a cold, hollow feeling that clung to my skin. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the dark fields beyond our backyard, wondering what she meant. Couldn't notice. Did she mean distract me? Remove me? I thought of the way Jonas had been driving faster lately. The way he left tools lying around the shop floor. The way he sometimes stared at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. The next morning, I decided I couldn't just wait for more recordings. I needed to see them together, catch them in the open. I called in sick at the clinic and parked my car in the gravel lot behind the Copper Mule just after sundown. From there, I could see the back door of the bar. The one the staff used to slip out for smoke breaks. I sat there for almost 2 hours, the cool night air seeping into my bones. Before the door finally opened and Sable stepped out, her hair catching the neon light, followed closely by Jonas. They didn't kiss. They didn't touch. But the way they looked at each other was more intimate than either of those things. And in that moment, I knew the recordings weren't just isolated moments, they were threads in a larger pattern, one I was about to unravel. I didn't go to the clinic the next day either. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with Jonas's smartwatch in my hands, turning it over like I was holding a weapon I wasn't entirely sure how to use. It struck me how something so small, Something he probably bought to count his steps and check the weather. Had become the one thing capable of undoing him. I'd thought about confronting him outright, playing the recordings in his face. Watching the lies melt off him like wax in heat. But there was a better way, a slower, sharper way. If Jonas thought I suspected nothing, he'd let his guard down completely. And if he let his guard down, I could get everything. That night, I pretended to forget to plug in his watch after charging it for him. But before I set it back on the counter, I opened the voice memo app and renamed the folder with the recordings to something harmless, farm expenses. Jonas was too careless with technology to ever look deeper than that. I also set the watch to automatically sync with my phone via Bluetooth, no matter where he was. It meant that every time he recorded something, even by accident, it would quietly copy over to me without him ever knowing. I didn't have to wait long for it to pay off. 3 nights later, Jonas claimed he had to drive to Burnett to pick up a special part for a combine. He kissed Molly goodnight, said he'd be back by midnight, and drove off in his truck. At 11:42, my phone buzzed with a new file. I sat in the dark, heart pounding as I pressed play. The first thing I heard was music, live guitar. Someone singing about lost love, and then Sable's voice, clear and warm, telling Jonas she'd been thinking about him all day. Jonas laughed, a low rumble I used to love, and told her he'd been working too much to think about anything else. She teased him for lying, and he didn't deny it. The conversation drifted to me. "Clara's been acting normal," he said. "Almost too normal. Makes me wonder." There was a pause, the kind that feels heavy, and then Sable said, "Then maybe it's time." Jonas didn't answer right away. I heard glasses clink, footsteps on wood. And then he finally said, "Not yet. She's smart. She'll see it coming if I move too fast." I replayed that part over and over, the words slicing deeper each time. It's time. Time for what? Divorce? To run off together? Or something darker? I didn't want to believe Jonas was capable of anything truly dangerous, but then again, I hadn't believed he'd have an affair either. The next day, I made my move. Jonas had a habit of leaving his watch charging on the kitchen counter while he worked in the shop. Around noon, I picked it up, opened the memo app, and pressed record. I spoke softly, knowing the microphone would catch every word. "Jonas, if you're hearing this, you should know I've been listening. Every word, every laugh, every lie. I know about Sable. I know about the bar. And if you think you're going to decide when it's time, you're wrong. I decide. And when I do, you'll never see it coming." I stopped the recording, saved it without naming it, and set the watch back exactly where it had been. That night, Jonas didn't mention the watch. He didn't mention anything at all. He seemed distracted, glancing at me in a way that made me wonder if he'd already found it. But he didn't bring it up. That was the thing about Jonas, he was good at hiding what he knew. Which meant I had to be better at making him think he knew less than he did. Over the next week, the recordings kept coming. Snippets of Sable asking if he'd taken care of it, Jonas telling her, "Not yet," and once, disturbingly, Sable saying she didn't want any mess. Each time, I saved the files, backing them up to a flash drive I kept in the lining of my nursing bag. But the more I listened, the more I realized I wasn't just gathering proof for myself anymore. I was building a case, one I could drop like a hammer when the time was right. And I knew exactly when that would be. The Copper Mule was hosting a Halloween party, the kind of event that drew half the town. Jonas had already mentioned he might stop by to see some friends. If I timed it right, I could make sure everyone saw exactly what I needed them to see. I called in a favor from Pete, one of the bar's part-time DJs. A patient I'd once helped get through a rough patch without sending him to the ER. I asked him if he could play something from my phone at exactly 9 p.m. Right when the bar would be packed and the music low enough for people to hear the lyrics, or in this case, the voices. He didn't ask why, he just said yes. And so the plan was set. On the night of the party, I watched Jonas get dressed, dark jeans, flannel shirt. The cologne he only wore when he wanted to impress someone. He kissed Molly on the forehead and told me not to wait up. I smiled, kissed him back, and watched him drive away. Then I picked up my phone, checked the files one last time, and headed out into the cool October night, ready to let Marble Falls hear the truth in Jonas's own voice. By the time I pulled into the gravel lot behind the Copper Mule, the place was already lit up like a lantern in the dark. Strings of orange and purple lights hanging from the porch rails. Carved pumpkins glowing on every step. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses spilled out into the crisp October air, mingling with the faint smell of cigarette smoke from the back door. I parked far enough away that Jonas wouldn't notice my car if he happened to glance out. Then slipped inside through the side entrance, the one that led past the kitchen and into the shadowy back corner of the bar. From there, I could see everything without being seen. Jonas was easy to spot, tall, broad shoulders, wearing that red flannel I'd ironed for him just yesterday, moving through the crowd like he owned the place. Sable was behind the bar, dressed as some kind of dark angel. Black wings folded against her back, glitter catching in her hair when she bent toward him to pour a drink. They didn't touch, not in any obvious way. But the way their eyes locked when she slid the glass toward him told me everything I needed to know. I checked my phone, 8:56 p.m. Pete was in the DJ booth, head bobbing to the music, and when I caught his eye, he gave me a quick nod. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I thought about what I was about to do. How it would land in this room where half the people knew me, where whispers would travel faster than the music itself. At exactly 9 o'clock, the song playing faded out mid-chorus, replaced by a burst of static. Conversations dipped, puzzled glances shot toward the speakers. And then Jonas's voice filled the bar. Clear, unmistakable. You don't know Clara. She notices everything. There was a collective intake of breath. And then Sable's voice followed, dripping with amusement. Then maybe we just need to make it so she can't notice. A low murmur swept through the crowd. Someone near the bar whispered, "As that?" But before they could finish, another clip played, Jonas laughing, saying, "Not yet. She's smart. She'll see it coming if I move too fast." The words rolled through the room like a slow wave, and I watched as Jonas froze mid-sip, his eyes snapping toward the DJ booth, then scanning the crowd with growing panic. Sable's smile faltered, her hand tightening on the edge of the bar. And then, the last clip, the one I'd recorded myself, came through. My voice, calm and measured, "Jonas, if you're hearing this, you should know I've been listening. Every word, every laugh, every lie. I know about Sable. I know about the bar. And if you think you're going to decide when it's time, you're wrong. I decide. And when I do, you'll never see it coming." The silence after was heavy, suffocating. For a moment, no one moved. Then the whispers began, sharp, cutting little threads that wove themselves into the air. Jonas's face flushed deep red, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't spit out. He shoved his way toward the booth, but Pete was already gone, slipping out the back door like we'd planned. I stayed in my corner, invisible, watching as Sable tried to say something to him, her wings brushing against a row of liquor bottles. He snapped at her, too low for me to hear, but whatever it was made her recoil. Her lips pressed into a thin line. People were watching now, openly, some with their phones out, some shaking their heads. In a town like this, public humiliation was a scar that never healed. Jonas stormed toward the front door, shoving past a man in a cowboy hat, and disappeared into the night. Sable stood frozen for a beat longer before yanking off her wings and tossing them onto the counter, her eyes darting toward the same side exit Jonas had taken. I could have left then, slipped out unnoticed. But I stayed just long enough to see the first Facebook posts go up on glowing phone screens. I knew by morning the story would be everywhere, from the diner where old men drank coffee at dawn to the school drop-off line. By the time I walked out into the cold night air, Jonas's truck was gone. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove down to the lake, parked by the water, and let the quiet soak in. My hands were still trembling, but not from fear. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but tonight I'd shifted the balance. I'd taken back the part of me Jonas thought he could control. And I'd done it in a way he could never undo. Out on the water, the reflection of the bar's distant lights shimmered and broke with every ripple, and I thought about how easily things fracture when you press just hard enough. Jonas didn't come home that night. When I pulled into our driveway after leaving the lake, the house was dark except for the porch light I'd left on, and his truck wasn't there. Molly was asleep upstairs at my mother's, where I'd sent her earlier in the evening under the excuse of letting her have a fun sleepover. That part, at least, hadn't been a lie. I didn't want her here to witness what I knew was coming. I waited in the living room until 3 a.m. The silence pressing in on me like a weight, but Jonas never showed. When dawn finally spilled across the fields, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where the first recording had broken my trust. At 7:12 a.m., I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. His truck door slammed, and a moment later he was in the doorway, still in the red flannel from the night before, eyes bloodshot, jaw tight. He didn't speak at first, just stood there looking at me like he was trying to read something in my face. "That was you," he finally said, voice low, almost flat. I didn't answer. His hands curled into fists. "You think this is a game?" I stood, forcing my voice to stay steady. "I think you've been playing one for a long time. I just decided to learn the rules." For a second, I thought he might lunge at me, but instead he laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You embarrassed me. In front of everyone. Do you know what that means in this town?" "It means they finally know the truth," I said. And his face darkened in a way that made my skin prickle. "You think you know the truth," he said slowly, "but you don't. And if you keep pushing, you're not gonna like what you find." With that, he grabbed his watch off the counter and walked out to the shop, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I stood there, pulse pounding, replaying his words. "You're not gonna like what you find." It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. The next few days were a strange kind of quiet. Jonas barely spoke to me, barely looked at me. But I could feel the tension humming under his skin. Around town, people avoided my eyes, though I caught enough sideways glances to know the gossip had spread far and wide. Sable hadn't been seen at the Copper Mule since the party, and part of me wondered if Jonas had told her to stay away. or if she'd decided the scandal wasn't worth the trouble. But on Thursday, the watch betrayed him again. I was folding laundry when my phone buzzed with a new file. I pressed play and heard Jonas's voice, sharp and angry. "You shouldn't have called me here." Sable's voice was tight, defensive. "You've made this worse, not me. Everyone's talking." "They're talking because you couldn't keep your mouth shut," he snapped. "Now she's got people watching me." There was a pause, and then Sable said something that made my stomach drop. "If you're so worried about her watching you, then take her out of the picture." Jonas didn't answer right away, and the silence between them felt louder than anything else. Finally, he muttered, "Just let me handle it." The recording ended, but the words stayed with me, clawing at the edges of my mind. Take her out of the picture. Handle it. I wanted to believe they meant divorce or leaving town. But there was a cold edge to their tone that suggested otherwise. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying every conversation Jonas and I had ever had about accidents, farm equipment, cars on back roads, hunters who weren't careful where they aimed. Out here, bad things happened all the time, and no one looked too closely. On Friday morning, I called my mother and told her to keep Molly for a few more days. I didn't explain why, just said work was busy. Then I started making my own preparations. I backed up every recording, printed a transcript of each one, and put the copies in an envelope addressed to the Burnett County Sheriff's Office with a note. "If anything happens to me, Jonas Whitmore should be your first call." I left the envelope in my desk at the clinic, knowing someone would find it if I didn't come in. By Saturday, Jonas's mood had shifted. He was suddenly talkative again, even charming, offering to take me for a drive out to the lake like old times. Every instinct in me screamed no, but I smiled and said I had errands to run. I could see the flicker of frustration in his eyes before he covered it with a grin. That night, my phone stayed silent, no new files, no pings from the watch. And somehow, that scared me more than anything. Sunday morning broke with a pale gray light that seemed to wash all the color out of the fields beyond our house. Jonas was already up, moving around the kitchen with unusual energy, humming to himself as he poured coffee. The shift in his mood was so obvious it was almost theatrical. Like he was playing a part just for me. "Thought we could take a drive today," he said, sliding a mug across the table. "It's been a while since we went down to the Overlook." The Overlook was 20 minutes out of town. A winding road through cedar and limestone cliffs that ended in a sheer drop over the lake. Locals went there for picnics in summer, but in October it was usually empty. My gut tightened. "I've got work to catch up on," I said lightly, sipping the coffee even though my hands were trembling. He leaned against the counter, watching me over the rim of his own mug. "It's Sunday, Clara. Work can wait." His tone was casual, but there was something under it, something that made me picture the edge of that overlook in my mind, the loose gravel at the lip, the way one wrong step could send you over. I smiled, careful not to let the fear show. "Maybe later." For the rest of the morning, Jonas stayed close, moving from room to room like he was shadowing me. When I went out to the laundry shed, I caught him standing in the doorway watching. When I came back inside, his eyes followed me until I disappeared down the hall. Around noon, my phone buzzed, not from the watch, but from Pete. His message was short: "Saw Jonas at the Mule last night. He wasn't alone." My heart kicked hard in my chest. I texted back, "Sable?" But there was no answer. Jonas suggested lunch in town, but I told him I wasn't feeling well. He didn't push, just nodded and stepped outside, saying he'd be back in an hour. The second I heard his truck pull away, I went to the closet and pulled out the small duffel bag I'd packed 3 days ago, cash, a burner phone, the flash drive with all the recordings, and Molly's birth certificate. I hadn't decided if I'd run yet, but I knew I had to be ready. When Jonas returned, he was carrying a small paper bag from the hardware store. He set it on the counter without explanation, then disappeared into the shop. Curiosity gnawed at me until I finally slipped out the back door, moving quietly to the shop window. Through the dusty glass, I saw him pull a length of rope from the bag, coiling it neatly on the workbench. He tested it between his hands, then laid it next to a heavy wrench. My mouth went dry. That night, after he'd gone to bed, I checked the smartwatch. No new recordings. Either he'd stopped wearing it around her, or he'd figured out the syncing. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and realized the silence was worse than any incriminating audio. It meant he was moving in ways I couldn't see, making plans I couldn't track. The next day, I went to the clinic early, the duffel bag in my trunk. I pulled the envelope from my desk and added a note in bold letters, "If I disappear." It wasn't an accident. My shift passed in a blur of routine tasks, blood draws, chart updates, but every time the door opened, my head snapped up, half expecting Jonas to be there. At 5 p.m., as I was locking up, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a voice memo from the watch. My breath caught as I pressed play. Jonas's voice, low and steady, "Tomorrow. We'll go for that drive." Then Sable's voice, softer, "Make it look like you lost control." My fingers went numb. Tomorrow. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. I drove home on autopilot, every mile bringing me closer to the man who'd just scheduled my death. He was in the kitchen when I walked in, smiling like nothing was wrong. Asking about my day, I answered automatically, all the while wondering if this was my last night in that house. When he finally went to bed, I sat in the living room with the duffel bag at my feet, the envelope on the coffee table, and the car keys in my hand. My choice was clear: run now and live, or stay and risk never walking out again. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the duffel bag beside me, my fingers tracing the edge of the flash drive in my pocket like a talisman, while the old wall clock ticked louder than it ever had before. At 4 a.m., I made my decision. Running would keep me alive, but it wouldn't end this. Jonas would still be out there, with his rope and his plans, and someday he might find me. No, I had to make sure he couldn't touch me again, not now, not ever. When the sun broke over the fields, I made breakfast like nothing had changed. Jonas came into the kitchen freshly shaved, wearing a pressed shirt and that same red flannel jacket from the Halloween party. He was in a good mood, joking about how it was the perfect day for a drive. I smiled and said I'd love to. I tucked my phone into my pocket, the recorder app running, and slipped the flash drive into the inner lining of my jacket. Molly was still at my mother's, and I'd told Mom we might be late getting her. As we drove, Jonas was relaxed, even playful, pointing out deer by the roadside, talking about maybe getting a boat next summer. But as the road narrowed into the winding cliff path toward the overlook, his voice grew quieter, his hands tighter on the wheel. When we reached the top, the lake spread out below us, silver and endless under the pale November sun. Jonas parked near the edge and cut the engine. The silence was thick, the kind that made you aware of your own breathing. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. You know why we're here, he said. I met his gaze. Yes, I said, but I don't think you do. Before he could react, I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. From my jacket pocket, the smartwatch, his smartwatch, started playing. His own voice filled the cold air. Tomorrow. We'll go for that drive. Then Sables, make it look like you lost control. His eyes widened, flicking from the watch to my face. You recorded every word, I cut in. And it's already in the hands of people who'll know what to do with it if I don't walk away. From this, I saw the moment the realization hit him. The calculation in his eyes as he weighed whether he could still go through with whatever he'd planned. His jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. You're bluffing. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my boots. Am I? I said over my shoulder. Because the sheriff's office doesn't think so. That was the twist. While Jonas slept last night, I'd driven into Burnett, woken the deputy on duty, and handed over the envelope. I told them everything. They hadn't promised much, but I'd seen the way the deputy's eyes darkened when he read the transcripts. Now, here we were, and every second Jonas hesitated was another second closer to them coming up this road. He got out slowly, walking toward me, hands spread as if to calm me. Clara, we can fix this. We can just forget. No, I said, my voice steady now. You've been deciding what happens for too long. I'm deciding now. Tires crunched behind us. I turned to see a sheriff's SUV rounding the bend, sunlight glinting off the windshield. Jonas froze, his face draining of color. You called them here? I told you, I said, I decide. The deputy stepped out, hand resting on his holster, eyes moving between us. Everything all right here? He asked. I didn't look at Jonas. I think you'll find the rest of the story on that flash drive in my jacket, I said. The deputy took it, glancing briefly at Jonas, whose shoulders had slumped under the weight of whatever he was realizing. As they led him toward the SUV, he looked back at me. Something between rage and disbelief in his eyes. But I didn't flinch. I watched until the taillights disappeared down the road. The echo of the engine fading into the hills. Alone at the overlook, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The lake below shimmered in the morning light, the wind cool on my face. For the first time in months, the silence felt clean, not the heavy, waiting kind, but the peaceful kind that comes after a storm. I knew the gossip in Marble Falls would keep spinning. That my name would be in every whispered conversation for weeks, maybe months. But I also knew I'd done more than survive Jonas Whitmore. I'd ended his game on my terms. And as I walked back to my car, the gravel shifting under my boots, I realized something else. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do isn't to run from the fire, but to make sure it burns exactly the way you want it to.